The upper corridor of Ashvale Hall was not a place where anyone expected to find Sir Neville Garston at 3:30 in the afternoon. It was a place for linen presses and nursery doors, for the narrow domestic traffic of housemaids and footboys, and for Master Thomas Hale, aged 7, who had developed the habit of sitting in the window embrasure at the corridor's far end to watch the deer in the frost-grey park below. It was not a place for guests, and Sir Neville Garston, who had been drinking steadily since the morning shooting party and had evidently lost his way between the billiard room and the East Wing's first floor, was unquestionably a guest. Harriet Pollock heard him before she saw him. The heavy, uneven footfall, the shoulder grazing the wainscot, the low mutter of a man reasoning imprecisely with himself about where he was going. She had come up to check that the nursery fire was laid before supper, a task beneath her office, but one she undertook. On principle, because the nursery footboy had a tendency toward neglect on party weeks when the excitement below stairs overrode his sense of duty. She rounded the corner from the linen stair and stopped. Sir Neville was moving with the particular momentum of a large man who has miscalculated the narrowness of a passage. Thomas was at the window, his small dark head bent over a book, his knees drawn up, and he had not yet heard the footsteps because the wind against the glass was making its own noise. Between them, the corridor measured perhaps 12 feet. Harriet crossed it in 3. She did not think that was the truth of it, though she would understand it only later, in the quiet of her own room, when the trembling in her hands had finally stopped. She placed herself squarely between Sir Neville and the window embrasure, her back to Thomas and her front to the guest, and she held her ground as Sir Neville's forward progress brought him to within 2 feet of her before he registered that she was there. He stopped. His face arranged itself into an expression of amused affront, the kind that men of his position produced when their right-of-way was interrupted by something they had not anticipated. "Out of my way," he said not unkindly, in the tone one uses when addressing furniture that has been badly arranged. "You have taken a wrong turning, Sir Neville," Harriet said. Her voice was level. Behind her, she heard Thomas shift on the window seat, and she did not turn around. "The East Wing is the staircase at the end of the South Passage. I will send a footman to guide you." "Sir?" Neville squinted. He was not, at his core, a cruel man, only an imprecise one, and his imprecision at this moment was being amplified by 3/4 of a decanter of port. He stared at Harriet for a long moment, then he turned, found the passage wall with one hand and moved away from her toward the South Passage. She did not release her breath until the footsteps had receded entirely. She turned. Thomas was watching her from the embrasure, his book forgotten, his gray eyes very wide. "Miss Pollock," he said. "Come down from there," she said. "Your fire needs seeing to." She did not know, until afterward, that Edmund Hale, the Earl of Ashvale, had been standing at the foot of the upper stair. That was the 3rd week of October, in the year 1814, and it was the week that changed everything. Though not immediately, the world in Harriet's experience did not alter itself immediately. It altered itself slowly, in the manner of a room's furniture rearranged in darkness, so that when the candle was finally lit, the positions of the chairs were suddenly wrong in a way that had no discrete beginning. She had been at Ashvale Hall for 14 months. She had come as lady's maid to the late Countess of Ashvale, a post she obtained through the recommendation of her father's oldest friend, the Reverend Mr. Gadd, Oakes of Coventry, who had written on her behalf to the estate's previous housekeeper, Mrs. Crane. When Mrs. Crane retired in the spring and the household found itself without a housekeeper 2 weeks before. The Earl's return from his London house, it was Mr. R. Alderton, the estate solicitor, who had proposed the solution, and it was Lord Ashvale himself who had sanctioned it in a letter of 3 lines, addressed to the household, without elaboration. Harriet had accepted the post with the consciousness that it was an irregular elevation, that she was 4 years younger than any housekeeper Ashvale Hall had held in living memory, and that she would be required to conduct herself with enough gravity to render the irregularity invisible. She had managed. She managed the staff of 23 with the methodical precision her father had taught her to apply to everything that mattered. Each member of the household understood in terms of their particular nature and their particular capability and their particular weakness. Each roster built to work with those qualities rather than against them. She had managed the account books, which Mrs. Crane had kept in a system of organized imprecision that Harriet had spent her first 2 weeks quietly correcting. She had managed the weekly correspondence with the London merchants, the quarterly inventory of the cellars, and the small accumulated griefs of a household that had lost its mistress and had not quite known what to do with the silence that followed her. And she had managed Thomas. She had not meant to. Thomas had found her in the library in her second month at 6:15 on a Tuesday morning, when she had gone to check that the cleaning of the shelves had been properly completed, and found instead a small boy sitting on the turkey rug with a book he could not yet properly read, looking at the illustrated plates. She had not sent him away. She had sat down on the floor beside him in her plain gray gown, with the keys at her hip, and she had read to him from the natural history plates as though this were an entirely ordinary way to spend a morning, because for a child whose mother had been gone 4 months, she suspected it needed to be. He had come back the next morning, and the morning after that. It was Lady Marjorie who noticed first. Lady Marjorie Hale was the Earl's aunt on his father's side, a widow herself, who had appointed herself the household social compass in the absence of a countess, and discharged that office with the thoroughness of a general reviewing fortifications. She had arrived at Ashvale Hall for the autumn house party on the 18th of October, 2 days before the incident in the upper corridor, with Lady Constance Vane at her side and 7 trunks, and she had found Harriet in the morning room reviewing the seating arrangements. Lady Marjorie had looked at the seating chart, pronounced it acceptable, and then said, in the tone of a woman leaving the real meaning for the very end, that she hoped Miss Pollock had not been spending time above her station in the family's private rooms. "I understand. Thomas has formed an attachment," Lady Marjorie said, adjusting her fan. She turned to Lady Vane, who was standing by the window in a cream and gold gown. "She is merely the housekeeper, Constance, and she forgets it. The boy needs a nurse, not an indulgent servant with literary pretensions." Lady Constance Vane, watching the park with the proprietary ease of someone who has already decided she likes what she sees, said nothing. She simply smiled, which was almost worse. Harriet noted the words. She did not alter the seating arrangements, and she did not respond. She finished her review, excused herself, and went to instruct the cook about the supper menu, because the house party began that evening, and there was a great deal still to be done. The house party had been arranged in part by Lady Marjorie, and in part by the demands of the political season. Lord Ashvale maintained a set of county obligations that required at minimum 1 gathering a year, at which the relevant gentleman of the Midlands could eat his food, shoot his pheasants, and feel they had been properly acknowledged. Sir Neville Garstin was among them. He was also among the few men in the county from whom the estate had borrowed, and the obligation to entertain him had a shading of financial prudence that Harriet was not privy to, but had inferred from the particular care Lord Ashvale took with the seating arrangements near Sir Neville, the decanters kept well filled at Sir Neville's elbow, and the absence of any check placed on Sir Neville's consumption, Harriet had understood immediately, in the way that housekeepers understand the unspoken dynamics of every household they run, that Sir Neville Garstin was being humored. She had also understood, with her particular and precise assessment of physical risk, that Sir Neville Garstin, humored past a certain hour, was a man who required monitoring. She had stationed a footman at the billiard-room door each evening, and had personally checked the upper corridor on every afternoon when the shooting party came in, because the combination of port and the disorienting grandeur of Ashvale Hall's upper stories was a combination not to be trusted. She had been correct. The afternoon of the incident, she had not seen the Earl at the foot of the upper stair. She had done what needed doing, taken Thomas back to the nursery, sat with him for 20 minutes while he ate his supper, and then gone down to oversee the kitchen's preparations for the evening. It was not until the following morning that she understood anything had shifted. Lord Ashvale came to find her. This was not customary. The Earl communicated with his housekeeper through the household's established channels. A note left with the butler, a brief interview in the steward's room when matters required it. He did not appear in the linen passage at 8 in the morning and say, quietly, "Miss Pollock, a moment if you will." She turned from the shelf of pressed table linen she had been reviewing and faced him. He was in his country clothes, the dark navy coat and the gray waistcoat and the cream breeches she had seen daily for a year, and had never until now been close enough to observe the vertical crease between his brows, set there by long and habitual concentration. His slate blue eyes held that composed, nearly still quality she had come to recognize as his default register. But there was something else in it this morning, something she did not yet have a name for. "I saw you yesterday," he said, "in the upper corridor." She said nothing. She waited. "You put yourself between Sir Neville and my son." "Sir Neville had taken a wrong turning, my lord," she said. "I directed him back toward the east wing." He looked at her for a moment. The crease between his brows deepened very slightly. "Yes," he said, "I saw that as well." He said nothing further. He turned and went back toward the main passage, and Harriet listened to his footsteps on the flagstones, and understood that she had been thanked in the particular language of a man who had not spoken that language in some time, and was still finding his way back to it. If you have ever stood in a room where the light is just beginning to change, before you can say with certainty that anything is different, you will know something of what Harriet felt in the days that followed. Stay with her a little longer. She is only beginning to see what he has already seen. She continued to run the household, to review the menus, to audit the cellars, to mediate the small daily collisions between the nursery staff and the housemaids. She continued to be invisible, in precisely the way that a good housekeeper ought to be invisible, present everywhere, remarked nowhere. But she noticed when Lord Ashvale paused in the corridor outside the library. She noticed when, at the supper he attended that evening, his eyes moved to her as she supervised the footman at the sideboard, and did not move away in the way they had always moved away before, immediately and without consideration, the way eyes move away from furniture. She noticed that after supper, when Sir Neville made a remark at the dining table about the inadequacy of the wine service, Lord Ashvale said, without raising his voice, "The wine service is perfectly correct, Sir Neville." He did not look at Harriet when he said it. "Your Grace," Sir Neville said, with the particular brightness of a man who wished to make a point, and could not quite locate its edges, "can the housekeeper not be instructed as to the proper sequence? Merely the housekeeper, I remind you. And yet she seems to have formed opinions. The table shifted, in the way that tables shift when a silence becomes purposeful." Lord Ashvale's face did not change. "Miss Pollock's arrangements are my arrangements," he said. "The sequence is correct." Sir Neville subsided into his glass. Lady Marjorie, at the foot of the table, lifted her fan, a fraction of an inch. Lady Constance Vane looked at Harriet, and Harriet looked at the sideboard, and the supper continued. She did not allow herself to think about what it meant. She had grown up understanding that the meanings, a woman in her position, assigned to small moments of attention were rarely the meanings those moments carried. She had been a clergyman's daughter who could read Greek, and had no money, and she had understood early that the world was not organized around what a woman was worth, but around what a woman possessed. She possessed an iron ring of keys, and a plain gray gown, and the knowledge of how to run a house of 23 servants, and that was precisely what she was permitted to possess. She went to the library that night, after the household was settled, and she sat at the reading table in the lamplight, and she was very careful with herself. The next morning she went to Lord Ashvale's study to discuss the arrangements for the following week's reduced household, as was customary at the close of a house party. He was at his desk when she entered, and he did not immediately look up, and in the moment before, he did. Harriet's gaze went to the portrait above the mantelpiece. She had seen it many times. She had simply never paused to see it in the particular way she paused now. The late Countess of Ashvale had been a fair-haired woman, with a composed expression and a slight forward inclination of the head that suggested she had been listening intently to something just below the painter's line of sight. Thomas had her coloring, and that inclination. The portrait had been cleaned recently, or perhaps Harriet was only now noticing, because the frame was free of the thin veil of dust that had settled around it in the months after the Countess's death. Lord Ashvale looked up. He followed the direction of her gaze without apparent self-consciousness, and then he looked back at her. "Cecilia," he said. "She died in September of last year." "I know," Harriet said. "I am sorry." He was quiet for a moment. On the desk before him lay a letter that Harriet recognized by its seal as correspondence from the London attorneys. She did not look at it. She waited. "I was in London when she went into labor," he said. "There were roads flooded north of Coventry. The rider was delayed. By the time I arrived, she had been gone 3 hours." He said it without inflection, the way one states an established fact. But his hand, which had been resting on the desk, folded itself into a closed shape at the edge of the paper. "I was in London managing the Northern Estate's debts," he said. "She needed me, and I was managing accounts. There was no redemptive comment to be made, and Harriet did not make one. She stood with her hands quiet at her sides and let him say what he had not. She suspected, said to anyone, because she was the housekeeper, and therefore not quite a person of consequence, and perhaps for that reason, somewhat safe. "I am sorry," she said again. It was insufficient. It was all there was. He nodded, once as though confirming the point's accuracy. Then he looked at the papers on the desk. "The reduced household," he said. "We should proceed." She sat in a chair across from his desk, and they proceeded. In the days that followed, something in the household's atmosphere altered in a way that Harriet could not precisely name, but could not quite ignore. It was not that Lord Ashvale spoke to her more than he had. He did not. In the ordinary transactional sense, the quality of his attention, when it did fall upon her, had changed. In the library one afternoon, returning a book that Thomas had left in the drawing-room, she looked up to find Lord Ashvale watching her from the doorway. He did not look away when she met his gaze. He simply said, "He has left his shoes under the writing table as well," and turned and went back down the corridor, and she stood for a moment with the book in her hands, and something warm and unwelcome moving in her chest. She observed him with Thomas. She had been observing this for months, the particular careful distance the Earl kept from his son, not unkind, never unkind, but measured, as though proximity were a thing that required deliberate management. After the incident in the upper corridor, the distance narrowed by some fraction that she could not quantify, but that Thomas, with the precision of a child attuned to such things, appeared to notice. The reading sessions in the library shifted. 3 mornings out of 5. When Harriet arrived, she found Thomas already there, and Lord Ashvale standing at the window, as though he had come to check on something, and had not yet found a reason to leave. He never sat. He stood and listened to Harriet's voice, reading the natural history, and sometimes said a word in correction when Thomas stumbled over something, and the 3 of them occupied the room together in a way that had no name and required none. She did not permit herself to read anything into it. She was the housekeeper. He was the Earl. The autumn was advancing, and the house party's guests would soon depart, and the household would return to its ordinary winter rhythm, and everything would settle back into its proper positions. She was certain of this. The house party concluded on the 28th, and the guests departed in stages over 3 days. Most of them, Lady Marjorie and Lady Constance Vane, remained. Harriet had anticipated this. Lady Marjorie had arrived with too many trunks to intend a short visit, and Lady Constance Vane had the air of a woman who has been told that her moment is approaching and is simply waiting in comfort for it to arrive. She moved through Ashvale Hall as though she were already measuring it, a quality Harriet recognized as not unfamiliar in women who had been correctly positioned by their families and told to be patient. She was pleasant, Lady Vane. She was gracious to the footmen and charming at dinner, and she sat very well at the pianoforte. Her pale blonde curls and her cream and gold gown making, exactly the picture in the candlelit drawing-room that Lady Marjorie had intended. Lord Ashvale was courteous to her. He was courteous to everyone. Harriet watched the courtesy from the edge of every room she entered, and found to her own considerable irritation that she could not quite read it. She was not supposed to be reading it at all. The frost arrived in the first week of November, and with the frost came the garden party that Lady Marjorie had organized, with the determination that the mild weather had no choice but to accommodate. The lawns were still passable, the rose arbor's bare canes making a kind of winter architecture against the gray sky, and Lady Marjorie had arranged for a marquee and a selection of the county's remaining visitors to attend. Harriet managed the outdoor arrangements with her usual precision. She was crossing between the marquee and the kitchen garden with a list in her hand when she heard Lady Vane's voice from the other side of the stone wall. There were 2 other women with her, voices Harriet did not recognize. "She is merely the housekeeper," Lady Vane said. Her voice was perfectly composed, the tone of a woman explaining something regrettable but obvious. "Whatever he imagines he sees in her, it cannot last. Lady Marjorie has already spoken to him about the impropriety of it. A man in his position cannot allow a servant to develop notions." Harriet stopped. The list in her hand was very still. "He will make the sensible choice," Lady Vane continued. "Men of his understanding always do, when the season requires it." She heard the murmur of agreement, the soft closing of the subject, and then the voices moved away. She stood in the kitchen garden path for a moment, her back to the wall, the frost-killed herb beds on either side of her, the gray sky overhead. She was 26 years old, and the daughter of a man who had told her that her worth was in her character, and she was standing in a kitchen garden, in November, being discussed as a problem to be managed. She had known this. She had always known this. The knowing had simply been quieter before. She went back to the marquee. She spoke to the kitchen staff about the warming of the tea service. She noted that the braziers needed attention on the west side. She did not allow her face to show anything. That evening, after the garden party was cleared and the household was settled, Lady Marjorie came to the steward's room. Harriet had been expecting someone to come eventually. She had not expected Lady Marjorie to come herself, but she understood, as Lady Marjorie settled into the chair across from the small writing desk, that the matter required a certain emphasis that a letter could not carry. "You have served this household well," Lady Marjorie said. She laid a sealed letter on the desk between them. "Lord Ashvale is grateful for your service during a difficult period for the family." Harriet looked at the letter. "The household is to be reorganized," Lady Marjorie continued. "It is anticipated that Ashvale Hall will have a countess before the spring, and naturally the new countess will wish to make her own arrangements. We feel it is best to make the transition early, rather than to allow any awkwardness to develop." Harriet picked up the letter. It was sealed with the estate's stamp. "Your wages are paid through the quarter," Lady Marjorie said. "And there's a letter of character that speaks very highly of your industry and your management. You will have no difficulty obtaining a post elsewhere. Mr. Alderton has suggested a suitable household in Yorkshire." "Yorkshire," Harriet said. "Quite a good house," Lady Marjorie said. Her fan was held at its measured height. Her expression was that of a woman who is doing something she is convinced herself is kind. "It will suit you very well." Harriet looked at the letter in her hand. She thought about Thomas, who was 7 years old, and had been reading the natural history plates alone in the library at 6 in the morning when she found him. She thought about the small blue book on her writing table upstairs, the one she had mended herself when its spine cracked, with needle and thread and a bit of paste, because it was Thomas's favorite, and the binding had been giving way for weeks. "Thank you, Lady Marjorie," she said. Lady Marjorie rose, adjusted her plum silk, and left. Harriet sat at the desk for a long time. Then she went upstairs and began to pack. She packed neatly and without haste, because she did not know any other way to pack, folding each gown with the same precision she brought to the linen shelves, placing each item in its logical order. Her room was small and her possessions were not extensive. The candle was burning low by the time she heard the small sound at the door. Thomas stood in the doorway in his nightgown. His feet were bare on the cold floor. "Where are you going?" he said. "Thomas," she said, "you will catch cold. Where is your nurse?" "She is asleep," he said. He was looking at the open trunk. "Are you leaving?" She did not in that moment lie to him. She could not. She said, "Come and sit here." He came and sat on the edge of her narrow bed, and she sat beside him, and she looked at his bare feet on the cold floor, and fetched her spare shawl and wrapped it around his shoulders. "Miss Pollock," he said, "you are not to go." "I have been very happy here," she said. "You are not to go," he said again, with the particular persistence of a child who has already lost one person and understands at some level below language that he is being asked to accept something he is not equipped to accept. She did not tell him it would be all right. She did not know if it would be. She held his small, cold hand between her two hands and looked at the trunk on the floor and the small blue book sitting on top of it, because she had intended to leave it for him. She had thought, when she first placed the book in the trunk, that she was being practical. He would find it in the morning. Someone would explain, in whatever words adults used for such explanations, that Miss Pollock had gone to Yorkshire, and she had left him the blue book, and she wished him every happiness. She had tried to make that thought sufficient, and had found it was not. Thomas turned his head and looked at the blue book at the top of the trunk. "That is mine," he said. "Yes," she said. "I was leaving it for you." "Then you were going to go," he said. The logic of it was precise and entirely 7 years old. She had packed her own things but left his, which meant she had accepted it. He looked at her with his father's eyes, that composed gray regard that in the boy had not yet learned to conceal the thing underneath it, the grief that he had been carrying since September of the previous year, the grief that had no good outlet, except a library at 6 in the morning and a housekeeper who sat on the floor. "You are the only one who reads to me now," he said. She could not answer that. Her throat would not permit it. She did not hear the footsteps in the corridor until they stopped. In the corridor, until they stopped. Lord Ashvale appeared in the doorway of her room, and the quality of his stillness in that moment was different from any stillness she had seen from him before. He looked at the trunk, he looked at Thomas in the shawl, he looked at Harriet. "Oh, Thomas," he said, "go back to the nursery." Thomas looked at his father and then at Harriet, and Harriet nodded, and he went. Lord Ashvale did not speak immediately. He looked at the trunk again, and the vertical crease between his brows was very deep, and then he looked at her. "My aunt has dismissed you," he said. "Lady Marjorie indicated that the household is to be reorganized," Harriet said. "Massa. The arrangements she has made are very sensible." She had no authority to make them. Harriet was quiet. "She had no authority," he said again, and his voice was level in the way she had come to understand was not coldness, but was in fact its opposite, the very deliberate steadiness of a man keeping something contained that was pressing hard against the containing. "My lord," she said, "I believe the intention was to spare the household any difficulty. If Lady Vane is to be mistress here, it is natural that arrangements should be made." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. "Is that what you believe is happening?" he said. She did not know how to answer that. He stepped into the room, which was small and which made the stepping in a significant act, and he stood at the other side of the trunk, and he said, "I will have this unpacked, my lord," she said. "I have something I must do," he said. "I will ask you to remain in this room until I return if you are willing." She looked at him for a long moment. His hands were at his sides. His face was very still. She thought about a woman with a forward inclination in a portrait above a mantelpiece, and a letter on a desk, and a man who had been in London when the writer could not get through the flooded roads. She thought about what it meant that this man had come to her room at 11 in the evening with that particular quality of intention she was only now beginning to learn to read. "I will remain," she said. He went. In the drawing room below, which she could not see, Lady Marjorie had arranged the evening gathering with the precision of a woman enacting a plan's final movement. The fire was lit. The candles were bright. Lady Constance Vane sat at the pianoforte, in her cream and gold gown, playing with the ease of someone who has practiced for an occasion, rather than for pleasure. 3 of the remaining county visitors were present, and Lady Marjorie sat in the chair from which she had presided over the autumn, with the expression of someone who has done what needed doing. She had not expected Lord Ashvale to come down. He came in through the south door. He crossed the drawing-room. He did not approach Lady Vane. He did not sit. Pond. He stood in the middle of the turkey carpet, and he said, into the room's listening silence, in a voice that required no elevation to carry, "Miss Pollock stays. She is to be my wife." The pianoforte stopped. Lady Vane's hands remained on the keys for one additional moment, and then she lifted them. Her expression did not shatter, but it altered, the composure thinning to something that looked, very briefly, like recognition. Lady Marjorie's fan closed. The 3 county visitors looked at one another, and then, with the collective instinct of people who understand they have been made witnesses to something, looked at Lord Ashvale. He looked back, steadily, without apology. "I should have spoken sooner," he said. He was not speaking precisely to the room, though the room was his audience. He was settling something in his own account, in the way of a man who has been managing at a distance and has decided to stop. "I am speaking now," Lady Marjorie said after a very long moment. "Edmund." It was the first time Harriet had ever heard the lady use his Christian name, which she learned from him later. "The family's expectations." "The family's expectations," he said, "are mine to manage. I thank you for your care of the household, Aunt, and I ask you to leave the matter of Miss Pollock to me." He left the drawing-room. Harriet heard his footsteps on the stair. She was standing at the window of her small room, and the candle was burning low. And outside, the first snow of the season was falling in soft, deliberate increments across the park. She heard the footsteps stop outside her door. He knocked. "Come in," she said. He opened the door and stood on the threshold. His face was very still, but she was learning to read stillness. "There is something I should tell you," he said. "Yes," she said. "I do not know how to be present," he said. "I have not known since Cecilia died. I managed accounts. I managed the estate. I managed everything except the things that could not be managed by management alone." He looked at her steadily. "I watched you step between my son and a danger without thinking, without calculating what it might cost you. You simply did it." He paused. "I have been watching you since the morning I came to find you in the linen passage, trying to understand how a person does that, how they stay present for something that cannot be managed and may cost them everything." The snow outside made no sound against the glass. The candle guttered slightly and recovered. "I cannot promise you certainty," he said. "I can tell you that I see you. I have seen you for some time. I should like very much to continue seeing you if you are willing to be seen." She had been a clergyman's daughter who could read Greek and had no money, and she had been told all her life that the world was organized around what a woman possessed and not around what a woman was worth. She had run a household of 23 servants and read to a grieving child in a library at 6 in the morning and stood between a drunken gentleman and a small boy in a corridor because there was nothing else to do. And she had been dismissed as merely the housekeeper by 3 people in 3 separate rooms of a house she had kept with more care than most of its previous occupants had managed. She thought of her father, and of what he had told her, and of what she had spent 14 months discovering. "You said you would have the trunk unpacked," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. And then something moved in his face that she had not seen before, something that came and went so quickly she might have imagined it, except that she did not think she had imagined it. It was the thing that came before a smile, in a man who had not smiled in some time, and was finding his way back toward it. "I did," he said. She crossed the room, and the snow fell outside, and the candle held. The winter that year was steady and cold, and Ashvale Hall settled into it with a particular quality of stillness that was different from the stillness that had preceded the house party. A better stillness. A chosen one. Lady Marjorie departed in the first week of December with a certain dignity and without, to her credit, any further remark on the subject that had been settled. Lady Constance Vane departed the same morning, and Harriet, who supervised the loading of the carriages, with the precision she brought to all logistical matters, observed that Lady Vane carried herself with the composure of a woman who has recalibrated her expectations and will not require anyone else's assistance in doing so. She was not a cruel woman. She had been confidently wrong, and the correction had been specific and witnessed, and she was managing it. Mr. Red. Alderton arrived in the second week of December with the papers that made the arrangement legal and formal, and Harriet signed her name beside Edmund's in the solicitor's small, precise handwriting and understood that what had been true for some time was now documented, which was a comfort of the particular Regency sort, where what was true and what was documented had not always agreed. On Christmas morning, Thomas came to the library at his usual hour, 6:15, and found both Harriet and his father there. Edmund was standing by the window with a cup of tea, watching the snow that had fallen overnight, and lay now across the park in the particular silver stillness that follows a windless night. Thomas looked at both of them with the assessing gravity of a 7-year-old, taking stock of a changed world, and then sat down on the turkey rug, and found the book that was waiting there. It was the small blue book, its mended spine smooth under his fingers, the careful stitching visible along the binding where Harriet had worked it back together. She had placed it there the night before. "You fixed it," he said. "I did," she said. He turned to the first page, with the care of someone handling something that has been repaired and is now to be respected accordingly. Edmund came and folded himself down to the floor beside his son, which was a thing Harriet had not expected to see. A man of his stature and his gravity simply sitting on the floor of his own library on Christmas morning. And she sat on Thomas's other side, the fire at their backs, the snow outside the tall windows continuing its quiet work. Thomas read. His voice was still finding its confidence with the longer words, and he looked up at Harriet when he reached them, and she said them softly so he could find them again himself, and Edmund leaned slightly forward to follow the place on the page, and the vertical crease between his brows was there, but different now, less like worry and more like attention. The attention of a man who has decided to be present, and is discovering that presence, unlike management, requires nothing beyond the willingness to stay. The fire held. The snow held. Thomas held the small blue book with both hands, its mended spine warm from his palms, and read. Outside the library windows the park lay white and still, the bare oak trees standing in their patient winter arrangement against the gray midland sky, and the snow continued to fall in the particular soft way of Christmas morning snow, unhurried, as though it too understood that the thing being made here did not require haste. The library smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and the faint, clean cold that leaked at the edges of the tall windows. And Harriet sat on the turkey rug with Edmund's shoulder warm beside hers, and Thomas's voice finding its careful way through the words. And she understood that this was what her father had meant all those years ago, when he had told her that a woman's worth was in her character and not her station. He had meant that it would find her, that if she held to it, it would find her in the end. If Harriet's story has moved you, leave a word in the quiet below. She did not know she was being seen. And then she was,